Welcome back to the Director's Garage. Your host and resident idiot, Michael. I don't know, guys. It's amp season here at the Director's Garage, and we're going to be doing a deep dive into, spoiler alert, a brand new magnificent amp from the folks at ZMF. It's called the Aegis, and it's, well, stunning.
It's story time at the Director's Garage. Grab a cup of joe.
Now, ZMF has emerged as maybe the most important player and arguably the most exciting in the headphone world. But if you're unaware, here's a brief history. Zach intended to have a career in the arts. Headphones weren't in the cards for him. In fact, ZMF stands for Zach Merbach Films, and he was teaching directing for a living. That was more than 10 years ago. He enjoyed working with wood, and he built some guitars in his spare time, and he would also build mods for T50 headphones. But then the student loans hit, and he realized he would need to earn some extra cash, and there was nothing he'd rather be doing than building headphones. So he started making products like the Icon, and before long, the Auteur and the Atticus too. The brand had a cult following, that is, until Zach started playing with beryllium. And that's the same element used in the Focal Utopia, by the way, but the Verite was the result. Now, the Verite was the headphone that put ZMF on the map. Everybody wanted one of these things. The cups were simply gorgeous. But the hardware on that headphone, well, for me it was a little lacking. At the time I said they felt a little bit like a collection of parts. But from my point of view, the headphone that changed everything was the Atrium. Now, the Atrium, I believe, was the true turning point where Zach took ZMF from a micro brand to mainstream. The Atrium felt complete. It was beautiful, and not just in the sound. The Atrium set ZMF on a winning streak few companies have matched. The Caldera, Atrium closed, Bouquet, and the Caldera closed, all massive successes. Now, the review on that Caldera closed is still a few weeks away, and if you're concerned, Zach has updated the builds on the entire Verite line to include that upgraded hardware from the Atrium.
Amps, amps, amps.
And now we got amps from ZMF. Now, Zach has messed around with some like little creations on the side in the past and sold them, but the Homage is really his first major production build from ZMF. I just love the retro styling on this thing. I love the vintage feel. But Zach had fallen in love with the sound of amps designed by Keenan McKnight. Now, he goes by the name Lord Gwyn on the forums. Searching for my precious, guys. Okay. Now, in 2022, he heard Keenan's latest creation, the Aegis, and he fell in love with the sound. It was a DIY presentation, though, but the plans were open source, so he set about creating his own chassis for that amp, which brings us to today. Now, I should note that Zach sent me the Aegis to review and return, and I gotta thank the ZMF crew over there in Chicago for the opportunity.
Open up the style file. This better be good.
You've got to start with styling and just look at this thing, guys. Look at it. Look at it. When I talk about Zach's designs, I often use the word tactile, meaning it's stuff you like to touch. It's stuff you like to hold and move around with your fingers. Every switch and knob on this thing is so satisfying. It's like that time travel thing, like you're entering an older world. The amp's design was inspired by aviation dashboards and old Zenith radio sets. Now, Zenith was a brand out of Chicago. I remember their signs all over growing up. They made TVs and radios when I was a kid, and I remember their West Side factory, which was just a few miles, as it happens, from the original Western Electric factory. This stuff all ties together. Now, Zach uses heavy-duty toggle switches across the front of the amp, but I'm particularly fond of the wooden power button, which is engraved with a lightning bolt that would give Harry Potter FOMO, if I'm being truthful. It has an Art Deco volume knob that's made out of walnut. It's beautiful and smooth in operation, and it's got a pair of meters. Meters, folks! They're appointed at either end of the front panel, and they're branded with a ZMF logo. Just delicious, man. Now, he aged the metal plates that decorate the front of the amp, but the stars of this show are most definitely those tubes and the decorative caps that cover the windings. The covers resemble antique jewelry boxes, and the tubes, well, they're front and center, lighting the way with their tubey goodness glow.
It's about power. Director's Garage.
Now, I'm not going to bore you with a ton of numbers, but the amp is capable of taking high input voltages and averages around a 2-watt output. Plenty for any ZMF headphone, and it will drive even the tougher brands if you stage a high input gain. But impedance is what you need to match here, and there's a 3-way toggle on the front that covers a wide range of headphones. You can drive standard headphones on either the 1/4-inch jack or the 4-pin XLR, and each covers a different range of impedance levels. This is kind of clever. Each headphone output spigot offers a different range of impedances based on where the switch is set. The XLR has the highest impedance, the 1/4-inch has kind of a middle range, and the 4.4 pin has a lower impedance designed to drive sensitive IEMs. And I should also note that this is a single-ended design that will play an important role on my personal decision about buying this amp. To properly set the impedance switch, you want to look up the impedance of the headphone you're using and match the impedance with the proper plug and the switch settings. The 1/4-inch range is between 5 and 31 ohms. The XLR is from 11 to 85 ohms. Now, there's some room for experimentation here. With 2 watts, you're pretty safe driving anything with the Aegis, so playing with the impedance settings and the voltages is kind of a fun exercise to get the sound you prefer.
Gain staging.
Take, for example, the Susvara. Now, with the DAC set at 6 volts, the high impedance mode sounds a bit edgier with a bit of grain to spice it up. I wonder if there's even a little bit of gain being added to the signal when you bump that impedance up. I don't know for sure, but it just sounds a little like it. Now, it's not unlike the sonic difference between the Class A and the Class A servo modes on my solid-state Zähl. But if I'm listening to jazz, I'm more likely to stage the gain higher on the input and go with a lower impedance setup, like the middle setting. But if I'm listening to rock, I'm more likely to maybe drop the input level and let the amp loose on high impedance to get a more punchy effect. These changes are a bit on the slight side. It's more like seasoning than wholesale changes to the sound, and yes, they are kind of fun to play with. All right, who's ready for a shootout?
We're having a shootout.
Now, the literature on this amp claims its cathode follower circuit makes the Aegis sound unlike other amps on the market. But comparing the Aegis to the Woo, WA5LE, I found these amps to be remarkably close. Both are expensive tube amps. The Woo costs more and takes more expensive tubes, and the Woo is more powerful at 5 watts compared to the Aegis's 2, and I'd hate to have watched my electric meter on the house spinning like a top while both of these amps were powered up and running. But yeah, the sonic differences between these two amps are surprisingly slight. Now, I used Like Candy from Elvis Costello, Riviera Paradise by Stevie Ray Vaughan, and I threw in Rhiannon by Fleetwood Mac for this session. And honestly, the biggest difference I perceived was a slightly more punchy percussive bottom end on the Aegis, with the slightest bit more sub-bass presence there. but a warmer, more grand, slightly more enveloping, laid-back bottom end on the Woo. Nothing dramatic, these are narrow differences, but the 300B has never been accused of being a particularly bassy tube. Both presented excellent detail. The Aegis was slightly sharper with an edge on the stage going to the Woo, which has a bit more of an expansive and open sound.
What's the location? Tell me about the
Imaging was a complete push to me. Both were excellent at placing guitars and drums and other instruments, following pan effects across the stage. The Aegis seemed to have a slightly more forward and edgy presentation, maybe, like I said, a touch grainier. A bit more fun, really, and the Woo is a little more smooth, it's cleaner, it's more pure and natural. Vocals have a bit more body on the Woo, they sound a little bit more real to me. Again, we're talking about small increments here, and folks, I don't think there's a significant reason sonically to take one of these amps over the other. It's very close. Each has more than enough power to drive the toughest headphones. If a gun were placed to my head, like what happens in the comments below my videos, well, I'd probably take the Woo because it has independent low and high output modes, low and high impedance settings, low and high gain settings, and the Woo has multiple inputs. Serves my purposes maybe a little bit more for this show. With the Aegis, you could only get one pair of RCAs on the input side. One thing I noted is that the Woo gets stronger the longer it's on. It really takes a good 30 minutes of runtime before the Woo hits its sweet spot. Both of these amps, though, are supreme tube amplifiers. You're not missing out with either one of these. These two amps sound more alike than different, and that's a good thing in my opinion. And you know, I'd also bet, as close as these two amps are in sound, I think with some clever tube rolling, I could get these amps to sound damn near identical. I'd advise you to buy whichever of these two amps ignites your passion. The Woo has a cleaner style and makes more of a show of the tubes. The Aegis has that gorgeous retro thing with intentional rough edges. Both feature some Art Deco cues. The Woo has a decidedly more modern aesthetic. The Aegis is the newer of the two designs, and you can make your audiophile friends FOMO from your latest purchase. And we love a good FOMO around here.
Looking for some synergy. Hey, listen. Yeah. Before it gets the best of me. Make it work, Lord.
All right, let's talk about headphone pairings. What matches up well? Well, I was all set to go with the Sesvara as my favorite pairing with the Aegis. And then I spent 2 nights with this amp paired with the ZMF Atrium, and it completely made me reconsider my opinion. The first night was spent listening to Lana Del Rey. The ethereal pop with its dynamic sub-bass had me in a hypnotic trance. Her vocal is lush throughout, and there's something about the combination of a dynamic driver and this tube thing that worked really well. Okay, the second night I paired the Atrium with the Aegis and R.E.M, revisiting those early albums that are so core to me. These aren't the best recordings ever. They are fairly mid-rangey in their sonic palette, but it just works. Mike Mills' bass lines are so melodic. There's something very McCartney-esque about his playing style, and Buck's arpeggios just sparkle through. There's something about that biocellulose driver of the Atrium matched with tubes. It's taking me back to those great Fostex headphones, but elevated, like refined. Those 2 sessions really brought me around on the Atrium with the Aegis, and I'll reiterate, if you aren't using the suede pads with the Atrium, you are missing out. The top end just opens up on the Atrium when you go with the suede. Now, interestingly, the Atrium is a 300 ohm headphone, so you got to go to high impedance on the Aegis and then drop the input voltage way down off your DAC. I was just at 0.6 volts. That's the sweet spot for the Atrium Aegis pairing. And then we got to talk about the looks, because folks, just check these two out. Is the Aegis with the Atrium not the most visually pleasing pairing you've ever seen? This is simply magical, and I think it really was my favorite pairing. But what were my other favorite pairings, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked, because prior to those two nights, I loved the sound of both the Susvara and the Modhouse Tungsten. Now, you need to set a higher voltage level, 6 volts to be specific, out of the DAC to drive each of these headphones. Now, on the Tungsten, you run it at high impedance. The Susvara, I could drop to the middle impedance or the high, depending if I wanted that little bit of edge or not. Now, the most interesting pairing for me was the Abyss, because on high impedance, the Abyss was peaky. I really didn't like the sound at all, but then I remembered that the 1266TC is a low impedance headphone, so dropping that switch to low took a lot of the edge off those highs, and the sound shaped up nicely. But I had to boost the output gain on the DAC to compensate for the low impedance. Now, the LCD-4 was also a good pairing with this arrangement. The LCD-4 can really do it all, and I know I'm selling them, but every time I use them, I'm reminded of why that headphone is so great. Using the Caldera, that showed me the speed that these tubes can muster. Very impressive. You have to remember to go to the lower impedance setting and 2 volts output on the DAC. And I gotta say, the new Titan filter that we installed on the Caldera during that recent Director's Garage live stream, it's really renewed my love affair with this headphone. You do remember that we live stream every single week, don't you? All right, whatever.
Damn sure.
So let's start bringing all of this home at last, okay? Now, the fact that Zach is offering a sub $4,000 amp that runs with my Woo WA5LE with its black caps and its pricey 300B tubes, that tells you a lot about how great the Aegis is and what a value this thing is for its price. The impedance settings offer some different flavors, and with the proper impedance match with your headphone, you're in for some great sonic experiences with this amp. Now, Zach said he loved the Aegis for its breadth, space, oomph, and realism. And I gotta say, point blank, I hear the same things he appreciated, so this is a mission accomplished. The build on this amp is gorgeous. It's just top grade. It's a joy to look at and operate. The switches, they're retro, bordering on crude. They're just fun to toggle. The volume pod has satisfying texture. It's cool, really cool. And who doesn't love a pair of meters? I spent an unusually long time with the Aegis for the purposes of this review. Normally a week or so, and I pretty much got all I need to put together my thoughts. This is an amp that had me calling up different music genres and different pairings. I kept going deeper into album cuts before I realized, hey, it's been 2 hours of listening and I haven't written a damn word. I found myself getting lost in this amp. It's just so smooth, and I get lost in the music, which is kind of the point, right? The Atrium with the Aegis setup, man, I think I could live with that pairing for a long, long time. If you're in the market for a tube amp, I see no reason not to recommend the ZMF Aegis. It's a gorgeous sounding amp with looks to die for at a price that's well under its sound quality. Supreme value here, in my opinion. ZMF has had a very difficult time coming up with bad products lately. And this amp is a great product from perhaps the industry's most exciting brand. Personally, though, what keeps me from buying this amp is the fact that I already own that Woo, and this amp is reasonably close to the sound of that Woo, and I have way too much money invested in the Woo to ever want to sell it. I'd get pennies on the dollar for my investment. It doesn't make sense to me. But if the Woo weren't here, this is the tube amp I would covet, I think. Zach's designs are emotional, they pull at the heartstrings, and the Aegis is another win in a long line of wins for ZMF.
Yo boy, what's on the show next?
I gotta send some love to Zach and Bevin at ZMF for allowing me to review this new ZMF Aegis amp. I swear it's on the way back to you guys. I'm not gonna hold it out on you, okay? It's simply remarkable and everything you'd really want in a relatively affordable tube amp. Now, next up, we've got another amp, one of the very best I've ever heard in the Ray Samuels Audio B21 Radar. Okay, you won't want to miss that. And there's a surprise twist in that one, something you won't see coming. Oh, it's going to be great. Cryptic much? Okay. We also have another ZMF review, the Caldera Closeback, still to come. And guys, there's a huge mega surprise on the horizon that just fell into my lap, courtesy of Mod House Maestro Ryan Dietz. Oh, there's so much ahead. Make sure you...
I said, darling.
Yeah, you know I'm going to do that. Okay, give this episode a thumbs up if you enjoyed the deep dive into ZMF's incredible new tube amp, or you can, do the other thing if you'd rather I turn myself into a human cathode. I can't say I blame you either way, and I'll see you before you know it.